The rifle had been empty for 3 days, and Caleb Turner knew that if he did not find food by nightfall, his children would go to bed with nothing but water in their bellies again. He stood on the porch of his weathered cabin just outside Salida, Colorado, watching the summer sun climb over the mountains in 1878, his hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. Inside, 10 children ranging from 2 to 16 years old waited for breakfast that would not come. Their mother had died bringing the last baby into the world 18 months ago, and Caleb had been drowning ever since, unable to keep his head above water long enough to provide for the family Sarah had left behind. The mining work had dried up when the silver vein ran thin, and the handful of odd jobs he managed to scrape together barely kept the roof over their heads. The garden had withered in the unusual heat, the chickens had stopped laying, and yesterday he had sold the last item of value they owned, Sarah's wedding ring, just to buy flour that would last them maybe 4 days if he stretched it thin enough. His oldest son, 16-year-old Matthew, had taken to hunting rabbits in the foothills, but game was scarce and the boy was still learning. The younger children, bless their hearts, never complained, but Caleb saw the hunger in their eyes and it carved pieces out of his soul. He had been a good husband once, a decent provider when Sarah was alive, but 10 mouths to feed on a dead-end miner's wages was impossible even in good times, and these were not good times. Caleb was 34 years old and felt twice that, worn down to the bone by grief and desperation. The sound of a wagon approaching made him lift his head. Through the morning haze, he could see a sturdy buckboard being driven by a woman, which was unusual enough to catch his attention. As the wagon drew closer, he straightened up, suddenly aware of how he must look with his patched clothes and hollow cheeks. The woman who pulled the horses to a stop in front of his cabin was not what he expected. She was younger than him, maybe 25 or 26, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes the color of amber that assessed him with sharp intelligence. She wore men's trousers beneath a split riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a leather vest over a simple cotton shirt. Everything about her spoke of capability and strength. "Morning," she said, her voice clear and direct. "I am looking for Caleb Turner." "You found him," Caleb replied, descending the porch steps with caution. Strangers rarely brought good news. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Flora Dawson," she said, wrapping the reins around the brake handle and jumping down from the wagon seat with easy grace. "I heard in town you might be looking for help. I am looking for work and a place to stay. Figured maybe we could help each other." Caleb blinked, confused. "Help?" "Madam, I appreciate the thought, but I cannot afford to hire anyone. I can barely feed my own family." Flora's expression did not change, but something flickered in those amber eyes. "Understanding, maybe." "I know. That is why I am here. I am not asking for wages, Mr. Turner. I am asking for room and board in exchange for work. I can cook, clean, hunt, trap, fix things, and I know farming. I grew up working harder than most men twice my size." "Why would you work for just room and board?" Caleb asked suspiciously. In his experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. "Because I need a place to stay, and I would rather work for my keep than accept charity," Flora said bluntly. "My parents died of fever last month. I sold their homestead to pay their debts, and I have been living out of my wagon since. I am tired, Mr. Turner, and I would like a roof over my head and honest work to do. I heard about your situation from Mrs. Henderson at the general store. She mentioned you had children who needed looking after." Caleb felt his throat tighten. Pride warred with desperation, and desperation was winning. "I have 10 children," he said quietly. "The youngest is not even 2 yet. The oldest is 16. It is not an easy situation. I did not come here expecting easy, Flora replied. She met his eyes steadily, and Caleb saw no pity there, only determination. I came here expecting honest work and a place to belong for a while. If you will have me, I can start today. Behind him, Caleb heard the cabin door creak open. He turned to see little Emma, barely 4 years old, peeking out with her thumb in her mouth and her blonde curls tangled from sleep. The sight of his daughter, so small and thin, made his decision for him. "All right," he said, the words coming out rough. "You can stay. But I want you to know upfront that things are bad right now. We do not have much." "Then we will work with what we have," Flora said simply. She reached into her wagon and pulled out a canvas bag. "I brought supplies, figured you might need them." When she opened the bag, Caleb saw flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and dried apples. His vision blurred for just a moment before he blinked hard and cleared his throat. "You did not have to do that." "I know," Flora said. She hoisted the bag over her shoulder like it weighed nothing and walked toward the cabin. Emma stared up at her with wide eyes as Flora paused on the porch. "Hello there, sweetheart. My name is Flora. What is yours?" "Emma," the little girl whispered. "That is a beautiful name," Flora said gently. "Is anyone else awake yet?" "Matthew and Lucy are," Emma said, gaining confidence. "The babies are still sleeping." Flora glanced back at Caleb. "Show me the kitchen and I will get breakfast started. You look like you could use some coffee." The cabin was small and cramped for 12 people, but Flora did not comment on it. She simply rolled up her sleeves and got to work, moving through the tiny kitchen with efficient grace. Caleb watched, still half convinced he was dreaming, as she built up the fire in the stove, mixed biscuit dough, and set coffee to brewing. Within minutes, the cabin filled with smells that had been absent too long. The children emerged one by one, drawn by the unusual activity. Matthew came first, tall and gangly with his father's dark hair and serious expression. Then Lucy, 14 and already carrying herself like a little mother to the younger ones. Then the twins, Thomas and Timothy, both 12 and inseparable. After them came Margaret, 10, then Samuel, 8, then George, 6, then Emma and her shadow, 3-year-old Annie. Finally, Matthew carried down baby Rose, barely 18 months old, from the loft where the children slept in a tangled pile of quilts. Flora greeted each child by name, asking Caleb or the older children when she did not know, and did not react to the sheer number of them except to start mixing more biscuit dough. By the time the sun had fully risen, every child had a plate with a warm biscuit, a slice of fried salt pork, and a cup of milk that Flora had apparently brought from her wagon as well. Caleb sat at the rough-hewn table, holding baby Rose on his lap, and watched his children eat like they had not seen food in days, which was not far from the truth. Flora served him last, setting a plate in front of him and a cup of strong black coffee. "Eat," she said quietly. "You are no good to them if you collapse." He wanted to argue, but she was right, and the smell of the food was too much to resist. The biscuit was fluffy and tender, the pork salty and satisfying, and the coffee was the best thing he had tasted in months. As he ate, Flora began cleaning the kitchen with the help of Lucy and Margaret, who both seemed eager to have another woman in the house. After breakfast, Flora surveyed the situation with a practical eye. She walked through the cabin, noting the holes in clothing, the worn-out shoes, the threadbare blankets, and the general state of neglect that came from a man too overwhelmed to keep up with 10 children's needs. Then she went outside and looked at the failed garden, the empty chicken coop, and the general disrepair of the property. When she came back inside, she found Caleb trying to settle a dispute between the twins about whose turn it was to fetch water. Flora stepped in smoothly, sending both boys to the creek with buckets and instructions to pick wild onions if they found any growing along the banks. "Mr. Turner," she said once the boys had gone, "we need to talk about priorities." Caleb nodded wearily. "I know the place is falling apart." "That is not what I meant," Flora said. She sat down across from him at the table, her expression serious but not unkind. "I meant we need to figure out what needs to be done first to get this family back on its feet. You have been treading water trying to keep everyone from drowning, but you need a plan." "I have been trying," Caleb said, and hated how defeated he sounded. "I know you have," Flora said quietly, "but you cannot do everything alone. That is why I am here. So let us figure this out together." They spent the next hour talking, really talking about the family situation. Caleb explained about the mining work drying up, about Sarah's death and the medical bills that had followed, about selling everything of value just to keep food on the table. Flora listened without interrupting, her amber eyes sharp and thoughtful. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "All right. Here is what I think we should do. First, we need to get food coming in regularly. I can hunt and trap, and I know how to preserve meat. I can also fish, and the Arkansas River is not far from here. Second, we need to replant that garden, but smarter this time. I know which crops grow well in high altitude and poor soil. Third, we need to get those chickens laying again or find new ones. Fourth, you need steady work, which means we need to figure out what skills you have that Salada needs." "I am a miner," Caleb said helplessly. "That is all I know." "That cannot be all you know," Flora said firmly. "Can you build things, repair things, work with horses?" Caleb thought about it. "I am decent with carpentry. I built most of this cabin myself when Sarah and I first settled here, and I know horses well enough. Worked in the stables when I was younger." "Good," Flora said. "Salada is growing. There is always need for carpentry and stable work. We will ask around town, see what is available. In the meantime, I will handle things here and make sure the children are cared for." "Why are you doing this?" Caleb asked suddenly. "You do not know us. You could find easier work anywhere else." Flora was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "My parents worked themselves to death trying to keep their homestead running after my brothers died in the war. I watched my mother fade away from exhaustion and grief, and my father followed her 6 weeks later. I could not save them, Mr. Turner, but maybe I can help save your family." "Maybe that is reason enough." Something in her voice made Caleb's chest tighten. He saw the loss in her eyes, the same kind of hollow grief he carried, and understood that Flora Dawson was not here out of pity or charity. She was here because she needed to be needed, because helping his family might help heal something broken inside her. "Thank you," he said roughly. "I do not know how I will ever repay you." "Help me fix this family," Flora said simply. "That will be payment enough." Over the next few days, Flora proved herself to be exactly what she had claimed. She rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, her energy seemingly endless. She took the children in hand with firm kindness, assigning chores appropriate to each age and teaching them as she worked. Lucy and Margaret learned to make bread and preserve vegetables. Matthew went with Flora into the foothills to learn proper tracking and hunting techniques. The younger children gathered kindling, picked berries, and helped in the garden that Flora had already begun replanting with seeds she had somehow acquired. Caleb watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and growing admiration. Flora never complained, never showed frustration even when Annie spilled a bucket of milk or George accidentally let the fire go out. She simply fixed the problem and moved on, her competence as natural as breathing. On the 4th day, Flora shot a young deer in the early morning. She field dressed it herself and hauled it back to the cabin, where she taught Lucy and Margaret how to butcher it properly, using every part of the animal. That night, the family ate fresh venison stew with wild onions and carrots from Flora's supplies, and Caleb saw color coming back into his children's faces. He also saw how they had begun to look at Flora with something like hope, especially the younger ones. Emma followed Flora everywhere, chattering constantly, and baby Rose reached for Flora whenever she came near. Even Matthew, who had been withdrawn and sullen since his mother's death, had begun to smile again when Flora praised his improving marksmanship. Caleb found himself watching Flora more than he should, noticing the grace in her movements, the strength in her hands, the way sunlight caught in her auburn hair when she worked in the garden. He noticed the curve of her neck when she leaned over to tie Annie's shoes, the sound of her laugh when Thomas told a ridiculous joke, the gentleness in her voice when she sang Rose to sleep at night. He tried not to notice these things. It felt disloyal to Sarah's memory, even though Sarah had been gone for 18 months. But Flora was so vibrantly alive, so present and capable and strong that Caleb could not help but be drawn to her like a plant turning toward sunlight. On the 7th day, Flora came back from town with news. "I talked to Mr. Peterson, who owns the livery stable on Front Street. He is looking for someone to help with the horses and do repairs around the stable. I told him you were good with both carpentry and horses, and he wants to meet you tomorrow." Caleb stared at her. "You did that for me." "For the family," Flora corrected, but her cheeks flushed slightly. "Someone needs to bring in steady wages, and you cannot do that sitting here feeling useless." "I do not feel useless anymore," Caleb said quietly. "You changed everything, Flora. This whole family has changed in a week." Flora looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing. Now go talk to Mr. Peterson and get that job so we can stop living on salt pork and biscuits." The next day, Caleb rode into Salada on one of Flora's horses, a sturdy mare she had insisted he take. Mr. Peterson was a gruff but fair man in his 50s, and he looked Caleb over with a critical eye before showing him around the livery. The place needed work, there was no denying that, but it was honest work and the pay was decent. "Mrs. Dawson spoke highly of you," Peterson said, leaning against a stall door. "She said you were a good man in a bad situation, and that you would work hard if someone gave you a chance." "She said that?" Caleb asked, surprised. "She did. She also mentioned you had 10 children to feed, which is why I am willing to pay a bit more than I usually would for this kind of work. I have grandchildren myself, and I know how expensive it is to keep young ones fed and clothed." Peterson extended his hand. "You can start Monday if you want the job." Caleb shook his hand firmly. "I want it, thank you, sir." When he returned to the cabin that afternoon, he found Flora in the garden with Margaret and Samuel, planting rows of beans. She looked up when she heard the horse, her eyes questioning, and Caleb could not help the grin that spread across his face. "I got it," he said. "I start Monday." The smile that lit up Flora's face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "That is wonderful, Caleb, truly wonderful." It was the first time she had used his given name instead of calling him Mr. Turner, and the sound of it in her voice did something strange to his heart. He dismounted quickly, suddenly needing something to do with his hands. "I could not have done it without you." "Peterson said you talked to him about me." "I just put in a good word," Flora said, brushing dirt off her hands. "You did the rest by being qualified and showing up. Do not sell yourself short." That night the family celebrated with a special dinner. Flora had made a dried apple pie with the last of the apples she had brought, and the children devoured it like it was the finest dessert in the world. After the dishes were washed and the younger children were in bed, Caleb found himself sitting on the porch with Flora, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "I do not know how to thank you properly," he said into the comfortable silence. You saved us, Flora. You saved my whole family. You would have found a way, Flora said, but her voice was soft. No, Caleb said honestly. I would not have. I was drowning and I was going to take all of them down with me, but you threw us a rope and pulled us out. Flora was quiet for a long moment. Your children are good kids, Caleb. They deserve a fighting chance at life. Sarah would want them to have that. How did you know my wife's name? Caleb asked, startled. Lucy told me, Flora said. She talks about her mother sometimes when we are working together. She misses her terribly. They all do, Caleb said roughly. And so do I. But it is getting easier to breathe now that you are here. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human, Flora said gently. She turned to look at him, her amber eyes reflecting starlight. Grief does not mean you stop living, Caleb. It just means you carry the loss with you while you keep moving forward. There is no shame in that. My wife was a good woman, Caleb said, needing Flora to understand. She was kind and patient and strong. She gave me 10 beautiful children and she died bringing the last one into the world. I owe her memory more than moving on after just 18 months. You do not owe her stagnation and suffering, Flora said firmly. You owe her the best life you can give to the children she left behind. That is how you honor her memory, Caleb, by living and making sure they thrive. Her words hit him like a physical blow, breaking through the wall of guilt he had been carrying for so long. His throat tightened and his eyes burned, and before he could stop himself, he was crying for the first time since Sarah's funeral. Not the silent tears he had shed in the dark when the children were asleep, but real sobs that shook his whole body. Flora did not try to stop him or tell him to be quiet. She simply moved closer and let him lean against her shoulder, her hand rubbing steady circles on his back while he fell apart. She was warm and solid and real, and Caleb clung to that reality like a drowning man clings to driftwood. When the storm passed, he pulled away, ashamed of breaking down like that. I am sorry, he said, his voice wrecked. That was not appropriate. There is nothing inappropriate about grief, Flora said quietly. You have been holding that in for too long, Caleb. It is all right to let it out. Not in front of you, he protested weakly. You have already done so much without having to deal with my breakdown as well. We all break sometimes, Flora said. I cried for 3 days straight after my father died. Could not stop, could not eat, could not sleep. Just cried until there was nothing left. And then I got up and kept going because that is what we do. We break, we grieve, and then we keep living. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the strength it must have taken for her to lose everything and still show up at his cabin offering to help strangers. You are remarkable, Flora Dawson, she laughed, but it sounded slightly shaky. I am just stubborn. There is a difference. No, Caleb said. There really is not. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Caleb was not quite ready to name. Flora seemed to feel it too because she stood abruptly, brushing off her skirt. I should check on the children before I turn in. Early start tomorrow, we are going fishing at the river. Flora, Caleb said, and she paused at the door. Thank you for everything, but especially for tonight. She smiled at him over her shoulder, and it was like the sun coming up. You are welcome, Caleb. Sleep well. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that began to feel almost normal. Caleb worked at the livery 6 days a week, bringing home steady wages that allowed them to buy proper supplies. Flora managed the household and the children with impressive efficiency, hunting and fishing to supplement their food stores, tending the growing garden, and teaching the children skills they would need to survive in the harsh Colorado territory. But it was more than just survival now. Under Flora's care, the cabin became a home again. There was laughter at mealtimes, the sound of children playing instead of crying from hunger, and a sense of security that had been missing for far too long. Flora mended their clothes, taught the girls to sew and cook, took the boys hunting and fishing, and somehow made it all look easy. Caleb found himself falling in love with her, though he tried to fight it at first. It felt too soon, too disrespectful to Sarah's memory. But Flora had a way of slipping past his defenses without even trying. It was in the little things, the way she remembered that he liked his coffee strong, the way she saved him the best pieces of meat at dinner, the way she smiled at him when he came home from work each evening. It was also in the bigger things, like the night 5-year-old George had a terrible fever and Flora stayed up with him for 2 days straight, bathing his forehead with cool cloths and coaxing medicine down his throat until the fever finally broke. Or the time Matthew got into a fight in town defending his family's honor, and Flora tended his split lip and black eye without judgment, then taught him better techniques for throwing a punch in case it happened again. She was everything they needed, and Caleb was terrified of losing her. What if she decided this life was too hard? What if she met someone in town and wanted to leave? What if she realized she deserved better than being an unpaid housekeeper to a widower with 10 children? These fears haunted him, but he kept them to himself, unwilling to burden Flora with his growing feelings. She had not signed up for a romance just for honest work and a place to stay. He had no right to want more from her, but he did want more. He wanted everything. One evening in late August, about 2 months after Flora had arrived, Caleb came home to find the cabin unusually quiet. Flora was outside behind the cabin, sitting on the bench he had built under the cottonwood tree, and she was crying. Panic seized him. In all the weeks she had been with them, he had never seen Flora cry. "What happened? Are the children all right?" "They are fine," Flora said, wiping hastily at her tears. "They are all inside playing a game Lucy made up. I just needed a moment." Caleb sat down beside her, his heart still pounding. "Talk to me. What is wrong?" Flora was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. "Today is my mother's birthday. She would have been 52. And I just realized that this is the first birthday I have not spent with her since I was born, and I will never spend another one with her again." "I am so sorry," Caleb said, his chest aching with sympathy. He understood that particular pain all too well. "I thought I was doing better," Flora continued, her voice thick. "I thought I had accepted it and moved on, but today it just hit me all over again that they are really gone and I am alone in the world now." "You are not alone," Caleb said before he could stop himself. "You have us. You have the children and you have me." Flora looked at him, her amber eyes swimming with tears. "Do I? Really? Or am I just the hired help who happens to live here?" The vulnerability in her voice broke something open inside Caleb's chest. "You are so much more than that, Flora. Surely you know that by now." "I do not know what I am to you," Flora admitted. "I know what I am to the children. They have made that clear. But you, Caleb, you are harder to read. Sometimes I think maybe you see me as more than just help, but then you pull away and I wonder if I am imagining things." Caleb's heart was thundering now. "You are not imagining things. I pull away because I do not want to presume, Flora. You came here looking for work, not for a widower with 10 children to complicate your life even more." "What if I want the complication?" Flora asked quietly. "What if I want all of it, the children and the chaos and you?" The world seemed to stop spinning. Caleb stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You cannot mean that." "Why not?" Flora challenged. "Why is it so hard to believe that I might have feelings for you, Caleb? Did you think I was immune to kindness and decency and the way you love your children? Did you think I would not notice how hard you work, how much you care, how you put everyone else before yourself? I thought you deserved better than a broken-down miner with too many mouths to feed," Caleb said honestly. "I thought I deserved a choice in what I want," Flora countered. And I choose this. I choose you and those 10 beautiful children and this chaotic, exhausting, wonderful life we are building together. If you will have me. Caleb could not speak past the lump in his throat. Instead, he reached out and cupped Flora's face in his work-roughened hands, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, and when they opened again, they were full of hope. "I am falling in love with you, Flora Dawson," Caleb said, the words raw and honest. "I have been fighting it because it felt too soon, but I cannot fight it anymore. You walked into my life when everything was falling apart, and you put us back together with your bare hands and your fierce heart." "How could I not love you?" Flora's breath caught, and then she was leaning forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender and desperate at the same time, full of grief and hope and the promise of something new beginning. Caleb pulled her closer, pouring everything he felt into the kiss, and Flora responded with equal intensity, her fingers tangling in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Flora rested her forehead against his. "I love you too, Caleb Turner. I love you and your children and this life we are making. I want to be part of this family, not just as help but as something more, if that is what you want." "It is all I want," Caleb said fervently. "You are all I want, Flora. You and the children and a future I can finally believe in again." They sat together under the cottonwood tree as the sun set behind the mountains, holding each other and talking about the future in ways Caleb had not dared to imagine before. Flora admitted that she had been falling for him since the second week, when she had watched him patiently teach little Annie her letters, even though he was exhausted from work. Caleb confessed that he had known he was in trouble when Flora had stayed up all night with George during his fever, singing old lullabies that reminded him of his own mother. When they finally went inside, they found all 10 children crowded near the window, trying to look like they had not been watching. Lucy was grinning like she had won a prize, and even Matthew looked pleased. "Are you two getting married?" Emma asked with the blunt honesty of a 4-year-old. Flora laughed, her cheeks flushing pink. "We have not discussed that yet, sweetheart. But you are going to, right?" Lucy pressed, her eyes bright with hope. "Because we want you to stay forever, Flora. Please say you will stay forever." Caleb saw the tears well up in Flora's eyes again, but this time they were happy tears. She looked at all 10 children, at the hope and love shining in their faces, and then she looked at Caleb. "I am not going anywhere," she promised. "This is my home now, and you are my family, all of you." The children erupted in cheers, and the next few minutes were chaos as they all tried to hug Flora at once. Caleb stood back and watched, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. That night, after the children were finally in bed, Caleb and Flora sat at the kitchen table discussing practical matters. If they were going to build a future together, they needed to plan for it properly. "We should get married soon," Caleb said. "Not just because it is the right thing to do, but because I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours. I want to build a life with you, Flora, as husband and wife." "I want that too," Flora said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "But Caleb, I need you to understand something. I cannot replace Sarah. I would never try to. She was their mother and she will always be their mother. I can only be what I am, which is someone who loves them and will do everything in my power to keep them safe and happy." "I know that," Caleb assured her, "and the children know that too. But Sarah is gone and you are here, and you have given us all a second chance at life. That is more than enough, Flora. That is everything." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Salida. All 10 children attended, dressed in their best clothes that Flora had spent days mending and altering. Lucy and Margaret served as bridesmaids, while Matthew stood up as Caleb's best man, his young face solemn and proud. The younger children fidgeted through the ceremony, but even they seemed to understand the importance of the moment. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Flora with all the love and promise he could convey, and the children cheered so loudly that the whole church echoed with the sound. The small congregation, mostly neighbors and people from town who had come to know the Turner family story, applauded warmly. Mr. Peterson from the livery had brought food for a celebration afterward, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store had donated a small wedding cake. It was not fancy or elaborate, but it was perfect, surrounded by the people who mattered most. That night, Flora officially moved from the small room off the kitchen where she had been sleeping into the larger bedroom that Caleb had once shared with Sarah. He had cleaned it out weeks ago, packing away Sarah's things with care and repainting the walls. It was a fresh start, a new beginning, and Flora made it clear that she understood and respected the significance of that. "I love you, husband," she whispered in the darkness after they had consummated their marriage with gentle passion. "I love you, wife," Caleb replied, holding her close. "Thank you for saving us. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for letting me," Flora said. "You gave me a family when I had lost everything, Caleb. You gave me a reason to keep going. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." "I could never regret you," Caleb said fiercely. "Never." The months that followed were not easy, but they were good. Autumn came to the Colorado mountains, painting the aspens gold and bringing the first hard frosts. Caleb continued working at the livery, and Mr. Peterson gave him a raise after seeing how reliable and skilled he was. Flora managed the household with her usual efficiency, putting up vegetables from the garden for winter, smoking fish and game meat, and making sure the children had warm clothes for the coming cold. But now, there was a joy and lightness to their days that had been missing before. Flora sang while she worked, and the children sang with her. Caleb came home each evening to a warm house, good food, and the woman he loved waiting with a smile and a kiss. The older children had fully embraced Flora as their stepmother, and the younger ones simply called her Mama, which made Flora cry happy tears every time. Winter arrived with heavy snows that buried Salida under white drifts. The Turner cabin was warm and well-stocked thanks to Flora's planning, and the family spent long evenings together by the fire, telling stories and playing games. Caleb taught the older boys to carve wood, while Flora taught the girls more advanced sewing and cooking. They read aloud from the few books they owned, and Flora's expressive voice brought the stories to life in ways that captivated even the smallest children. It was during one of those long winter evenings that Flora made an announcement that changed everything once again. She waited until the younger children were in bed, then gathered Caleb and the three oldest, Matthew, Lucy, and Margaret, in the kitchen. "I have some news," she said, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. "I am expecting a baby. You are going to have a little brother or sister come summer." The reaction was immediate and joyful. Lucy and Margaret hugged Flora with squeals of delight, while Matthew grinned and shook Caleb's hand with the solemnity of a young man. Caleb himself was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed with emotion. Another child, his and Flora's child, born of love and hope instead of duty and expectation. "Are you happy?" Flora asked him anxiously. "I know 11 children is even more than 10, but I thought maybe," Caleb cut her off with a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. "I am overjoyed," he said when he could speak again. "Flora, you have given me everything. One more blessing is just one more reason to wake up grateful every single day." The news spread through the family like wildfire, and even the youngest children understood that something special was happening. Emma immediately declared that she hoped for a sister, while George was equally adamant that they needed another brother. Caleb and Flora just laughed and held each other, marveling at how far they had come from those desperate early days. The pregnancy was not easy. Flora continued working as hard as ever, and Caleb worried constantly that she was overdoing it. But Flora was strong and stubborn, and she refused to slow down until her body absolutely demanded it. The older children stepped up to help more, and Caleb rearranged his schedule at the livery to be home more often. As Flora's belly grew round with their child, Caleb found himself falling even more deeply in love with her. She was beautiful in her pregnancy, glowing with health and happiness despite the discomfort. And she was still the same capable, strong woman who had walked into his life and turned it upside down in the best possible way. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought new life everywhere. The garden that Flora had planted the previous year came back stronger. The chickens they had acquired began laying prolifically, and the whole family prepared for the arrival of the newest Turner. The baby came on a warm June evening in 1879, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Flora had first arrived at the Turner cabin. The labor was long and difficult, and Caleb paced the porch with his heart in his throat, remembering Sarah's death and terrified of losing Flora the same way. But Flora was a fighter, and when the midwife from town finally emerged with a squalling infant wrapped in clean blankets, Caleb could have wept with relief. "You have a son," the midwife announced with a tired smile. "Strong and healthy, just like his mother." Caleb rushed inside to find Flora exhausted but radiant, holding their newborn son against her chest. The baby had a shock of dark hair like Caleb's and eyes that would probably turn amber like Flora's. He was perfect. "Meet your father," Flora whispered to the baby, then looked up at Caleb with tears streaming down her face. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased does not begin to cover it," Caleb said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arms around both of them. "You are incredible, Flora. Absolutely incredible." They named the baby James, after Flora's father, and he became the darling of the entire family. The older children doted on their new brother with an enthusiasm that was sometimes overwhelming, and Caleb had to remind them to let the baby sleep. Even baby Rose, who was now nearly 3 years old, seemed fascinated by the tiny newcomer. Flora recovered from the birth slowly but steadily, and within a few weeks, she was back to managing the household with James strapped to her back in a sling she had sewn herself. Caleb watched her navigate life with 11 children and never once heard her complain. If anything, she seemed to thrive on the chaos, her laughter ringing through the cabin as she juggled nursing an infant with teaching the middle children their lessons and helping Lucy prepare dinner. The summer of 1879 was one of the best of Caleb's life. The livery work was steady and well-paying, the garden was producing abundantly, and his family was healthy and happy. He and Flora had settled into a partnership that worked beautifully, each of them complementing the other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. She was still the strong, capable woman who had saved them, but now she was also his wife, his lover, and the mother of his newest child. One evening in late July, Caleb came home from work to find the cabin strangely quiet. He walked through to the back and found Flora sitting under the cottonwood tree, nursing James while the other children played down by the creek under Matthew's watchful supervision. "Hello, husband," Flora said with a smile as he approached. "You are home early." "Peterson let me go early since I finished all the repair work ahead of schedule," Caleb explained, sitting down beside her. "Thought I would come home and spend time with my family." "Your family appreciates it," Flora said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Look at them, Caleb. Look at what we have built together." Caleb followed her gaze to where his children, their children, played in the golden evening light. Matthew was teaching the twins to skip stones on the creek. Lucy and Margaret were picking wildflowers with Emma and Annie. George and Samuel were building something elaborate out of sticks and mud. Even little Rose was there, toddling after her older siblings with determined steps. "It is everything I never thought I would have again," Caleb said quietly. "A year ago I was ready to give up, Flora. I was so tired and so lost, and I did not think there was any way out. And then you showed up like an answer to a prayer I did not even know how to say." "I was lost too," Flora admitted. "I was angry at the world for taking my parents, and I did not know what to do with myself. But then I heard about you and your children, and something inside me said this was where I needed to be. This was home." "You saved us," Caleb said, turning to look at her. "Every single one of us. You took a broken family, and you put us back together with your strength and your skills and your love. I do not know how I got so lucky, but I thank God for you every single day." "We saved each other," Flora corrected gently. "You gave me purpose and belonging when I had nothing, Caleb. You let me into your life and your heart, and you trusted me with your children. That is not a small thing." James had fallen asleep at her breast, his tiny face peaceful and content. Flora adjusted her shirt front carefully and then shifted the baby to Caleb's arms. He took his son automatically, marveling at how small and perfect he was. "You ever miss it?" Caleb asked. "Your old life before everything changed?" Flora considered the question carefully. "I miss my parents every day. I will always miss them. But do I miss the life I had before? No. That life was hard and lonely, and I was just surviving, not living. This life, chaotic and exhausting as it is, feels right. It feels real. I would not trade it for anything. Even when the children are driving you crazy," Caleb teased gently. "Especially then," Flora said with a laugh. "Because even the crazy moments remind me that I am part of something bigger than myself. I am building something that will last, Caleb. These children will grow up and have children of their own, and they will remember what we taught them about family and love, and never giving up even when things seem impossible." "You really are remarkable," Caleb said, echoing the words he had spoken to her months ago. "I am just stubborn," Flora replied, echoing her response from that night. "Same thing," Caleb said, and kissed her as the sun set over the mountains and their children played nearby, safe and happy and loved. The years that followed were full of the ordinary struggles and joys that make up a life. There were hard winters when money was tight and everyone had to tighten their belts. There were illnesses and injuries and the inevitable challenges of raising so many children. Matthew grew into a fine young man and eventually left to start his own life, finding work at a ranch north of Salida. Lucy married at 18 to a kind young farmer, and Margaret followed a year later. But through it all, Caleb and Flora remained the anchor that held the family together. They added 2 more children to their brood over the years, a daughter named Grace in 1881, and another son named Daniel in 1883, bringing the total to 13 children. The cabin that had once seemed impossibly cramped had been expanded twice with Caleb's carpentry skills and help from the older boys. Flora never stopped being the strong, capable woman who had saved them. She hunted and fished and managed the household with the same efficiency she had shown from the beginning. But now there was also softness in her, a contentment that came from being loved and valued. She and Caleb had built something real together, something that would endure. In the summer of 1885, the family gathered for a celebration. It was the 7th anniversary of Flora's arrival at the Turner cabin, and the children, now ranging in age from 23 to 2, had conspired to throw their parents a party. There was food and music and laughter, and Caleb found himself standing at the edge of the chaos, watching his enormous family with a heart so full it ached. Flora came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. At 32, she was still beautiful, her auburn hair touched with just a few strands of silver, her amber eyes as sharp and intelligent as ever. The years of hard work had left their mark in lines around her eyes and calluses on her hands, but to Caleb, she had never been more lovely. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder in the familiar gesture they had shared hundreds of times. "I am thinking about that first day," Caleb said. "When you drove up in your wagon and offered to work for room and board, I thought you were crazy." "I was a little crazy," Flora admitted with a laugh. "Completely desperate and running on sheer stubbornness. But it worked out, did it not?" "It worked out better than I could have ever imagined," Caleb said. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "You walked into my life when I had given up hope, Flora. You had skills and strength and a heart big enough to love not just me but all of my children. You saved this whole family, and then you made it even bigger and better. I love you more than I have words to express." "You found the words just fine," Flora said, her eyes shining with tears. "And I love you too, Caleb Turner. I loved you when you were a desperate man who could not feed his children, and I love you now that you are a successful businessman with a livery of your own and a house full of thriving children. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." Caleb had indeed bought the livery from Mr. Peterson 2 years ago when the older man retired. It was doing well, and Caleb had even hired help of his own, including his son Samuel, who had a natural gift with horses. The family was not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and secure in ways that had seemed impossible 7 years ago. "Dance with me," Caleb said impulsively, pulling Flora into the clearing where some of the older children had started playing music. Lucy's husband had brought his fiddle, and the lively tune filled the evening air. Flora laughed but allowed herself to be led into a dance. They spun and swayed together, moving with the easy familiarity of two people who had spent years learning each other's rhythms. Around them, their children danced and played and celebrated, and Caleb thought that this, right here, was what happiness looked like. Later that night, after all the children had finally settled down, Caleb and Flora sat together on their porch, watching the stars come out. The mountains loomed dark against the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. It was a sound Caleb had heard thousands of times, but tonight it seemed to carry a note of contentment. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Flora asked quietly. "When I asked why you would accept help from a stranger, I said I had 10 children and I could not feed them," Caleb replied. "I said I was desperate. And I said I had skills and strength and I wanted to help," Flora continued. "I meant it, Caleb, every word. But I did not realize then that helping your family would become my whole life, and I would not want it any other way." "You did more than help," Caleb said. "You saved us, and then you loved us, and then you became us. You are the heart of this family, Flora. Without you, none of this would exist." "We built it together," Flora insisted. "You worked yourself to the bone to provide for us. You loved your children even when it was hard. You made room in your heart for me when you did not think you had space for anyone else. We saved each other, Caleb, and we saved this family together." She was right, of course. It had not been one person's effort but both of them, working side by side, that had transformed a desperate situation into something beautiful. Caleb had provided the foundation with his determination and love for his children, and Flora had provided the skill and strength to build something lasting on that foundation. I am grateful every day that you drove up to my cabin in that wagon, Caleb said. Even when the children are driving us both crazy, even when money is tight, even when everything seems to be going wrong, I am grateful for you. And I am grateful for you, Flora said. She laced her fingers through his, and they sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other at the worst possible time and made it into the best possible thing. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. The twins left for their own adventures, and then George and Samuel. Emma and Annie grew into beautiful young women with their mother's strength and their father's kindness. The younger children, Rose, James, Grace, and Daniel, grew up in a house full of love and security, never knowing the desperate hunger that their older siblings remembered. Through it all, Caleb and Flora remained partners in every sense of the word. They worked side by side, raised their children together, and loved each other with a depth and constancy that only grew stronger with time. The passion of their early relationship had not faded but had transformed into something deeper, a love that was woven into every aspect of their lives. In 1895, when Flora was 42 and Caleb was 51, they became grandparents for the first time when Lucy's daughter was born. The baby girl was named Sarah, after Caleb's first wife, and Flora held her with tears streaming down her face, understanding the honor that Lucy was bestowing. "She would be so proud of you," Flora told Caleb that night as they lay in bed. "Sarah, I mean. She would be proud of how you raised your children and how you rebuilt your life. I hope she knows somehow that they are all right, that they are happy and loved." "If she knows, then she also knows it is because of you," Caleb said. "You gave them a mother when they needed one most, Flora. You gave them everything." "We gave them everything," Flora corrected, as she always did. "Together." As they moved into their later years, Caleb and Flora finally had more time for each other. The youngest children had grown and were making their own ways in the world, and the house that had once been bursting at the seams was suddenly quieter. They took walks in the evenings, revisiting old haunts and creating new memories. They traveled a bit, visiting their scattered children and meeting grandchildren who were starting to arrive with increasing frequency. But they always came back to Salida, to the cabin that Caleb had built and Flora had transformed into a home. It had been expanded and improved over the years until it was barely recognizable from the desperate, neglected place it had been in 1878. But it was still theirs, still the place where their love story had begun. On a warm summer evening in 1900, 22 years after Flora had first arrived, the family gathered once again. All 13 children came home, along with their spouses and a growing number of grandchildren. The celebration was for Caleb and Flora's anniversary, but it was also a celebration of everything they had built together. Caleb looked around at the crowd of people, all connected to him and Flora through blood and love, and felt a sense of completion. This was his legacy, not wealth or fame, but a family that was strong and united and capable of facing whatever challenges life threw at them. Flora stood at his side, her hair fully silver now but her amber eyes as bright as ever. She had aged gracefully, her face lined with wrinkles that came from years of laughter and smiling. She was still strong, still capable, though she moved a bit slower now and let the younger generation do more of the heavy lifting. "We did all right, did we not?" she said softly, echoing words she had spoken many times over the years. "We did better than all right," Caleb replied. "We did something extraordinary, Flora. We took a broken situation and we made it whole. We raised 13 children who are good people, and they are raising good children of their own. We built something that will last long after we are gone." "I regret nothing," Flora said firmly. Every hardship, every struggle, every difficult moment was worth it to get here, to this place where we are surrounded by love and family. I regret nothing either, Caleb agreed. He pulled her close, holding her as he had held her thousands of times before. Except maybe that I did not tell you I loved you sooner. Flora laughed, the sound still as bright as it had been when she was 25 and full of fierce determination. You told me exactly when you were ready to tell me, and that was perfect timing. As the celebration continued around them, with music and laughter and the sounds of children playing, Caleb and Flora danced together one more time. They moved slowly now, their steps careful but still perfectly matched. Two people who had spent more than 2 decades learning to move as one. Their children and grandchildren watched with smiles and tears, understanding that they were witnessing something special. This was what true love looked like, not the passionate rush of youth, but the steady, enduring flame that survived hardship and time and emerged stronger for it. When the last guests had finally left and the house was quiet, Caleb and Flora sat together on their porch as they had done so many times before. The mountains were dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, and the air smelled of pine and wild roses. I am tired, Flora admitted, leaning her head on Caleb's shoulder. But it is a good tired. The best kind of tired, Caleb agreed. The kind that comes from a life well lived. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who no longer needed words to communicate. They had been through too much together, shared too many joys and sorrows to need constant conversation. Sometimes the silence was enough, filled with the presence of the person you loved most in the world. You remember what you asked me that first day, Caleb said eventually. You asked if I would have you, if I would let you stay and work for room and board. I remember, Flora said. You looked at me like I was crazy. I was desperate enough to accept help from anyone, Caleb said, but you were not just anyone, Flora. You were exactly what I needed, what we all needed. You were the answer to every prayer I had been too tired to say. And you gave me a home when I had lost everything, Flora replied. You gave me a family and a purpose and a love I never expected to find. We saved each other, Caleb, in every way that matters. We did, Caleb agreed. He took her hand, feeling the familiar calluses and the strong fingers that had worked so hard for so many years. And if I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing. Neither would I, Flora said. She lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. Not one single thing. They sat together under the stars, two people who had found each other in the darkest of times and had built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. Their love story was not the stuff of fairy tales. There had been no magic wands or fairy godmothers, just hard work and determination, and a refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. But in the end, it was a love story worth telling, about a man who had 10 children and could not feed them, and a woman who had skills and strength and saved the whole family together. And in saving the family, they had saved each other, finding a love that would endure for the rest of their lives and echo through generations to come. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, Caleb and Flora finally went inside to their bed, walking hand in hand like they always had. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did. But they would face it together, as they had faced everything for the past 22 years. Together, they had taken a story of desperation and transformed it into one of hope. They had proven that even in the hardest times, love could flourish and families could heal, and second chances were not just possible, but could be more beautiful than anyone dared to dream. Their legacy would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the lessons they had taught about perseverance and love, and the importance of never giving up on the people who mattered most. And long after they were gone, the story would be told of how Flora Dawson had driven up to a desperate widower's cabin with supplies and an offer to help, and how that single act of courage had transformed not just one life but many. It was a story about survival and strength, about the power of choosing to show up even when the odds seemed impossible. But most of all, it was a love story, about two people who found each other when they both needed saving and built something extraordinary together in the wild heart of Colorado. Years continued to pass in a gentle rhythm. Caleb eventually retired from the livery, selling it to Samuel, who ran it with the same pride and skill his father had shown. Flora slowed down but never stopped moving, always finding something to do with her hands, whether it was knitting blankets for new grandchildren or tending the garden that still flourished behind their home. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1903 with another huge family gathering. By then, they had 17 grandchildren and one great-grandchild on the way. The house was loud and chaotic and perfect, full of the kind of noise that comes from a family that genuinely enjoys being together. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and only a few of the older children remained, Matthew stood up with his glass raised. At 41, he was a successful rancher with a family of his own, but he still looked at his father and stepmother with the same love and respect he had shown as a teenager. "I want to say something," Matthew announced, waiting until everyone was quiet. "When I was 16 years old, I thought my life was over. My mother had died, my father could barely function, and I was watching my brothers and sisters starve slowly because there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was angry and scared, and I did not think things would ever